Welcome to Decision Space, the only podcast that takes place right here between the turns in your favorite games. I'm Brendan.
And I'm Jake.
And this week, we're tackling Magic the Gathering. How you doing, Jake?
I am doing great, man. Thanks for joining me here a little later than our intended thing so I could get outside.
Yeah, no, totally happy to play some disc golf. It's amazing. I'm so excited. We've been anticipating talking about Magic the Gathering for so long, so I'm really excited to dig into it, but also it's the time of year for outdoor games, so that's wonderful too. I guess, quick, before we get to the synopsis, I know you're all anxious for our Magic the Gathering synopsis. How are we going to summarize 30 years of this game? But before we get to that, we have some housekeeping. First of all, we have a bunch of new listeners, and I just want to say thank you so much for tuning in. We're so excited that you're here. Our podcast saw a huge bump this week, and if you're enjoying Decision Space so far, whether you've been with us since week one or if you came to the podcast this week, thank you. And we'd love for you to share. We're still hoping to grow. So if you dig it, pass it along. Also, because Jake and I have wanted to create a space where we could convene everyone who listens to Decision Space to continue the awesome conversations after the show and allow listeners to contribute to the conversations. So officially this week, we're announcing that we're starting a Discord community for Decision Space. And if you're interested in joining that, Discord is sort of I'm sure most of you know what it is, but it's sort of like a IRC Redux platform where you can have conversations on a slew of different topics. So we're starting one for Decision Space. It'll be in the show notes. Come discuss games with us.
Yeah, I can't wait. It's definitely something we've wanted to do from the very beginning, but thought maybe we'd build up just a little bit of listenership first. So we're hoping that some folks will be in there to talk about games. And also, I'm excited to hopefully use that as a place to organize some games on Board Game Arena and Yucata. So come play games with us too.
Perfect. Well, throughout this episode, I'm going to do my best not to overrun the conversation with random Magic the Gathering card names. So with that, Jake, what's your synopsis?
All right. Magic the Gathering is the greatest game ever. 10 out of 10 is what I would say if I was 12 years old. That's probably what I would say if I was 16 years old, maybe 20 years old. But here I am, 29. I've experienced a bunch of other games besides Magic. And looking back at it, a little bit of time removed, there are a few things that a few nitpicks I have with the game that I just can't totally overlook. I'm so of two minds about this game because I've had so many amazing experiences. It's easily the most defining game of my life. But would I recommend it to somebody now, having experienced so many more games? It's a harder sell. I'm ultimately coming down to it as a 6.5 out of 10.
What?
It's a game I still love. There's, if a friend of mine has a booster box and it's like, we're organizing a draft, come over, have a few beers, play Magic, like I will be there. Like I'll be breaking the door down. But I can't just like wholeheartedly recommend it to anyone.
Super fair. Very fair point. Before I get in and respond to what you're saying, I'm going to read mine because it's the way we're supposed to do this. Richard Garfield's Magic the Gathering was a paradigm-shifting landmark release. It's a colossus of a game and somehow also one of the most nimble game systems in popular play today. Magic's ability to reinvent itself consistently over the course of the nearly 30 years since its inception is a tremendous achievement. Magic will be remembered as one of the most influential games of the 20th century and is a game that defies ranking. Mostly, it's just a whole lot of fun.
And your rating?
No, it defies rating.
Wait, what? Dude, that's so unfair.
I can't rank it.
I'm taking my rating back if that's the game we're playing.
Only one of us gets the turn in the middle of our synopsis.
Oh my god.
I feel like one thing, so I really want to get into would we recommend this to other people, but I feel like we should have our discussion first, and it will illuminate why maybe I feel like no, I'm just going to get into it. Screw it. I'm wrong. I feel like, Jake, you're so right because there's so few people who I would recommend this to, but for the people who haven't played Magic, who I know would enjoy it, I think for me, it's like a 10 out of 10 recommendation. Like I want them to play it right away. But I think that because the game is at the point that it is 30 years on, and so many people have played it, mostly people will know if it's a game for them or not. And like, I'm never going to say to someone who like is coming into the world of board games and like just experienced, like, I don't know, looking at my shelf, maybe like Patchwork with me. I'm not going to be like, oh, now it's time to play Magic the Gathering.
Well, you're ready.
Yeah. But with that said, I think that it's a game system that like, it's just incredible. I think it's one of the most amazing games ever made.
I completely agree. And if you're sitting there and you're like, to me, Magic is a 10 out of 10, you're not wrong. Like, I've been there. I've been for most of my life. I was there. It's an incredible achievement. Like, there is nothing like it. So if that's the game for you and you want just endless cards to explore, like you can't. There's a good reason why so many people who play Magic don't play any other games. Yeah.
I think to that point too, I'm going to bump around our notes a little bit here, Jake. I think to that point, one of the reasons why I think Magic is a game that defies rating is because Magic the Gathering is really mini games. It's a shared rule set that tons of different games play it. And so by saying that, what I mean is there's a shared set of rules of Magic, but falling into that, or you can play Commander, you can play Draft, you can play Sealed, you can play Constructed, which falls into like either Standard or Vintage or Modern, or you can play different products like Conspiracy or Plane Chase. And then there's like casual Constructed, like Kitchen Table Magic or Middle School Magic, which was super casual for me and very competitive for you, Jake.
But if you had to give, like, I don't know, that rule set a rating, maybe out of 10, what would you give it?
It defies rating. I think that the rule set of Magic the Gathering is one of its strongest points. And after playing Magic a bunch growing up, and then walking away from the game for almost 20 years and then returning to it, the thing that surprised me most about it was how strong the core game is and how much it relies on things like bluffing and sort of we're donkey space. So the space in games where it's, I know that you're going to do X, so you think I'm going to do Y, so I'm going to do Z instead. Magic is a game that actually amplifies so many of these like really fruitful core game spaces in such a meaningful way. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't know about the game.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other quick caveat, and then we'll get into the game breakdown and the synopsis, is that Magic is a massive game. There's over 20,000 unique cards in the game of Magic the Gathering. And every set, there's been over 100 sets. I can't believe that. How many games have that much content?
That seems wrong.
I counted it this morning. I know, it seems so wrong. If you count like core sets, and then I'm not even counting like commander decks and that sort of thing. Someone might be like, no, you're wrong, Brendan, but I counted and I was like, what?
That's just it is mind blowing.
Yeah, it's huge. So obviously our discussion isn't going to speak to everything, and we're going to try to speak in really general terms, which ultimately, if you are a fan of Magic, your experience of this game is going to be different than our experience of the game because we've all experienced different pieces of it. So we hope you'll bear with us as we just try to address sort of what we feel is the heart of the experiences we've had with it.
Yeah, that sounds great, man.
And then I guess with that, just a quick breakdown. So we've sort of alluded to this, but Magic the Gathering first was released in 1993 by Wizards of the Coast. It was published by Peter Atkinson and designed by Richard Garfield. It was really the first TCG. So it took the trading card game aspect, or it created trading card games. It took sports cards like baseball and basketball cards. And it said, what if you made a game out of these things? And that is what ushered in this sort of paradigm shift. And I think we take for granted how special that was. And that's really a huge aspect of what helped usher in this modern era of friendly local game stores to some degree, that these stores could rely on selling Magic product and holding Magic events. And that created a space for board games to show up in those stores. I know the first place I ever saw Catan was in a store that I went to play Magic the Gathering.
Same here. Yeah. And I definitely had that moment. Like, what is this?
What are these boxes?
People playing Catan at a table. It's like, move. We're trying to play Magic.
It's Friday night.
Yeah. So dude, that's so true, man. It is it's been like such a good point. Like for so many of those friendly local game stores, it's like they exist to sell Magic cards. Like that is what is bringing home the bacon. So, which sadly a lot of people think is changing as MTG moves away from that model. But it's probably not the time or space for that kind of conversation. But it's just so weird to think of it. You're absolutely right. Like I was not thinking of Magic going into this conversation as the incredibly innovative game it is, because it's so old, but it's still around and played. And I mean, it truly was innovative in so many ways.
Yeah, and so foundational. And I think Magic's going to cast a long shadow, and it's very hard to perceive a shadow when you're standing in it. And we're still in the heart of Magic. I think for many years, I sort of, when I wasn't playing, thought that Magic was on the downwards trend and was so wrong. Like when I played Magic was before the heyday. Like now is the Magic heyday.
Yeah, I mean, it's bigger than ever. I mean, I think it was just really recently Hasbro released their earnings, and Magic brings in more money than like all their toys combined, like their toy department. Yeah. It's a Magic company that sells toys.
Totally. So if you're coming to this conversation, you're here because you like our discussions on board games. You haven't flirted with Magic the Gathering. You haven't played it because you always saw it as that sort of arcane game from the 90s. We're going to go into a rule synopsis. It's going to be pretty high level because I cannot teach you all of Magic the Gathering in 2 minutes. It's impossible. And I wouldn't want to. Part of Magic the Gathering is you get in and every card has its own rules text printed on it. And once you have the bones, your deck builds out the body and it builds out the soul. So here we're going to slip into the rule synopsis, give you a really high level overview. And I promise if you've never played Magic before, it'll give you enough that you can ride through the conversation with us.
I can't believe you didn't rate it. I said 6.5 and then you just don't rate it at all.
I'm sorry.
I didn't know that was an option, man. I struggled so hard. I was like, is it a 6? Is it a 10? Is it a 5? Is it a 9.5?
In Magic the Gathering, players take on the role of planeswalkers, powerful Magic users able to traverse the many unique planes of the multiverse. As planeswalkers, players do battle with one another, drawing mana from the land around them, casting spells, utilizing artifacts, and summoning creatures, all depicted on individual cards drawn from each player's personal deck. Players begin a game of Magic with 7 cards in hand, and at the start of each of their turns, following the first turn in the game, the active player draws 1 new card from their deck. Each turn, players may play 1 land card from their hand to the board, and then utilize any lands they control in play to add mana to their mana pool, which may then be used to cast spells, summon creatures, or do any number of actions on their turn, and occasionally casting spells in response to their opponent's actions on their opponent's turn. During each player's turn, they may also attack an opponent, using summon creatures. The opponent then decides how to resolve the attacks, either taking damage directly or utilizing their own creatures to engage in blocking the attacking creatures. A player defeats their opponent typically, but not always, by reducing their opponent's starting life total to 0. In Magic the Gathering, there's so many rules that live on individual cards, so it's best to just hop in and get going with the game. I definitely encourage you, if you're interested, to take a quick look at gameplay online or even glance at a rule set on Board Game Geek. But that's Magic the Gathering. Awesome. So hopefully that helped ground you some in the game. And I think it's important going into this conversation that you have a sense for Jake and I's background with the game. Do you want to talk about your history with Magic, Jake?
Sure. Definitely check out our episode on competitive play for just like a more general background. But the really brief is I played Magic at what I would consider a competitive level in middle school and high school. And before that, I was playing casually with friends. I think even as early as like 6 years old, literally.
Wow.
And I have memories of, in some of the old sets of Magic cards, the lands have printed on it like tap, add a land. And we would play like that meant like search your deck to get a land. Like we were playing wrong, like not knowing the rules and like still loving Magic at that age. And I mean, it's a really important game to me. I think like, as I was, a kid, literally like forming my identity of who I am. Like Magic was a big part of that. I spent a ton of time in my formative years at Magic the Gathering stores, at Magic the Gathering tournaments. And I have just so many memories, good, bad, like literally sobbing because I'm like missing like the top cut of a tournament by like one round as like a 10-year-old, like, achieving wins at my first Friday night Magic. Like a time a buddy ripped off a bunch of my cards, part of my collection. Connecting with people over Magic in college, like way later in life, like people, on the Ultimate Frisbee team with me who, I didn't know as gamers. And then I, walk into the hotel room at tournament, they're on the floor playing Magic. It's like, you guys play Magic? Like sick. Like you got an extra deck, it's like always been a part of my life. So for that, like, it's always going to be something I look back on incredibly fondly.
Yeah, that's so awesome. At some point, not in this podcast, I need to hear the story about your friend ripping off your cards, because
I feel like that's like a quintessential Magic story.
So wait, did he rip you off in a trade? Is that what you mean?
No, well, no. It was like a bunch of us were playing competitively. Were like sharing cards, like sharing collections, and he like sold off a bunch of stuff that like wasn't, and like disappeared, like burned bridges. And there were like 5 or 6 people that was, we were all like trying to
pooling cards,
trying to build decks, get a gauntlet going, because we were really, seriously like grinding, trying to make the Pro Tour at that time. So that's there are grimy people in the world in any hobby, but I feel like that's unfortunately kind of a common thing with Magic, whether it's that or somebody ripping off a kid in a trade or whatever. Like, I'll give you this like 8/8 creature for that, like, Black Lotus.
I think that Magic definitely. So I played Magic more casually than you in middle school. So the first time I remember experiencing Magic, one of my childhood best friend, Jonathan, came over, and he's like, my friend Kevin, who is both of our mutual friends, his older brother taught us this game. You're going to love it. And I was like, okay, we'll see. And we sat down on my ottoman, knees on the floor, and he handed me a 7th edition starter deck. It had Arrow Elemental on the start, so it was like blue. And he was playing one with this card on the cover of the box called Draken. No, I don't even remember. Draken Blackblades is older, but it doesn't matter. We sat down, he taught me the game, and I was like, this is incredible. I don't even understand it, but I love it. It's amazing. And I played Magic very casually in middle school. So from probably the time that I was 10 until 14 or so, his dad started playing with us. We had a group of friends at school where we would all play over lunch, before school. Whenever we could like fit a game in, we'd do it. And we were just playing with whatever cards we had. So we played with cards ranging from like unlimited cards back in the day, all the way up to like the current set, starting with Invasion, then Odyssey, and Onslaught. Those blocks, that's like the meat of what I was playing. And it was so fun when someone would bring a new deck, usually people who had older siblings, and they had discovered cards in a closet that they were allowed to borrow. And we were like, what is this card? This is ridiculous. So I had a really similar experience. And I also, as a game designer, I think I spent a lot of time, I was also a single child, spent a lot of time building decks that I thought would be interesting to play against each other, and then seeing how they played. So I spent a lot of time on the floor of my bedroom, like just building decks and then trying to play the decks against each other. Just like so much fun. It's hard to imagine me like doing that now, though. Now I just design prototypes and then play them by myself. So not that different, actually. But yeah, Magic, it blew my mind. It was the coolest thing I'd ever seen in a lot of ways. And I'd seen the Pokemon trading card game before, and I just thought this was like more complex, more interesting. I don't know. So yeah. I think that's a good background for us. But now we're going to do the impossible, Jake. And I'm going to ask you to go first.
Oh, great. Yeah.
Can you characterize the decision space of Magic the Gathering? Like, what's its size? What's its shape? How does it feel playing the game?
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, obviously it's a big question. So, we're constraining this to like playing the game. Nothing like, we're not talking like decisions you're making, building your deck, or even in a draft, like when you're actually shuffled up, you've drawn 7 cards, and you're stare across from the opponent. I feel as though this decision space is very frequently small, like much smaller than I think other games that we've covered on this podcast, because like the constraints of the game are extremely significant, right?
Yeah.
On your first turn of the game, your options are very small, right? You're playing a land, and that's more than likely it. I mean, I was gonna say like there's exceptions to that, but like just to know that throughout this conversation, there's an exception to everything we say, because like it's Magic is crazy like that. So just like I'm just gonna put that like just put that asterisk after every single sentence, and we'll be good. But so it's like you've got some lands, and then everything you're doing is so reactionary to the inputs of what you have in your hands and what your opponent is doing, that I feel like that constraining element of the game rarely leads to a decision space that feels like extremely robust to like what is normal in modern day, like kind of Euro style games that we're familiar with.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I feel like I totally understand where you're coming from, and I can't disagree with anything you've said at all. I think the important distinction too is that we're discussing in characterizing the decision space once you've shuffled up your hand of cards. But I do think that there's a few things. I think that there's on average fewer decision points, but I think the consequence of the decisions that you're invited to make are very high. It's a game where every decision that you can make in the game really, really matters. So I think that though you probably have ultimately like a more constrained decision space, the consequence of the choices feels so meaningful that on an emotional level, it's really exciting because the feedback is really direct. You generally know when you made a bad choice in this game, and that allows you to improve. And then also, I think Magic is a game that does a really good job of growing its decision space dynamically over the course of the game. The land system does this. It creates dynamic growth of the decision space, and that it gates the decisions that you're allowed to make based on how much mana you have. And on turn 3 of the game, you might have 3 lands, or you might have 1. On turn 5,
might have 0.
Or you hopefully not 0. Hopefully you mulliganed. And I do think, I don't know how much we want to talk about like mulliganing, but I think that you talked about, so you shuffled up your deck cards, you have 7. The fact that you can mulligan in this game is so important to me from the decision space because it creates a really high degree of agency. And the modern mulligan rules that you like shuffle up and then you draw 7 again and then you put 1, you put it back on the bottom. So good. I love that. And I wish that more actually board game sort of hobby style card games had hand sifting mechanics like that.
Why don't all games have that? It's just such a good mechanic.
Exactly. It makes even there's a chance when you mulligan, right? You start at 7 cards, so mulligan means you go down to 6, but in Magic you get to look at 7, then you put 1 on the bottom. There's a chance that like, oh, you went down to 5. You don't go past 5. If you go past 5, you're going to lose probably. Like you almost always. But I still think that agency is really important. We've talked so much about how sometimes it's more important that players feel like they're in control rather than the consequences of their choices really mattering. And I think Magic does a good job of that.
Yeah. I agree with what you're saying, like about the word you use is like, it's exciting. And I agree, even though I feel like the decision space often feels small, it's always exciting some way or another. And I mean, I think that is like that excitement and drama present on every turn is like responsible more than anything else for like the staying power of Magic. And that's at all levels of the game too. Do you want to respond to that?
Well, very quickly, I guess we'd be remiss not to mention the fact that the other thing that's amazing about Magic's decision space is how different it is every time. Every player is coming at the game with their own equipment, their own cards, their own deck. And every time the deck gets shuffled, it's different. So every decision space in Magic, even if they're similar, is functionally probably pretty unique.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Yeah, and I think the other thing you said that I agree with is like the dynamic decision space, which is you're right. It grows over the course of the game, right? I mean, we both agree the decision space is small at the beginning, and then theoretically it gets bigger and bigger. Though there are exceptions. Blah blah blah. But the other thing I think that is maybe worth talking about too is the dynamic nature of the decision space is also it's dynamic based on like your own knowledge of the game.
Yeah.
And I think this is kind of like a little bit of a tricky bit because if you're just like get a starter deck of Magic and you get two and you're playing as somebody else who's new to the game, that decision space is going to be a lot smaller because you don't know what is the other deck is capable of doing besides just like the very broad strokes where competitive level players are spending time memorizing every card in a set if it's like a limited style tournament or they know every major archetype that is likely to show up at a tournament, like what those decks are trying to do, and the decision space of like, okay, these are the tools I have, these are the tools I'm assuming my opponent has. Like they have these lands untapped, so like these are the cards I could potentially face, and then trying to find, I think a lot of times, I don't know, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but a lot of times like the game at its best is players trying to identify their win condition and their path to victory. And like when you're doing like cutting through all of this information that you have, the game feels so rich and rewarding, but it like the learning curve, right? Like the barriers to get there are, steeper than in any other game in existence, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Since I developed an interest in game design, and like I've always been interested in some level, but I've gone back and there's some part of me that's always been really tied to Magic, has really been interested in the game, even when I haven't been playing it. And there's something that Richard Garfield has said about Magic since the beginning, since before he even conceived of it, or as he was conceiving of it. He always wanted Magic to be a game bigger than the box. So you get the game, and the game that you own, the game that you bought, there's so much more to discover. And I think that what you're speaking to ultimately is probably the greatest strength of Magic, is it's a game that can be as big as you want it to be. It can also be as small as you want it to be, right? Like my wife so lovingly, though she is 0% interested in Magic, bought me for Christmas 4 Jumpstart packs. Jumpstart is this set where you open a pack, you shuffle 2 of them together, and then you play. So she bought those for me. We played on Christmas. To her, Magic was just that. And it was fun. She enjoyed it. And she was like, maybe we can play again in a future year. But until then, know that this was your gift and we will not be playing Magic again. And I was like, great, this was lovely. Thank you so much. But it's a game where, right, so we could just play the current set. We could play a even larger set that looks at 10 years of cards, or we could play sort of formats or where it's whatever. Every card ever. And to your point, Jake, like you can make the possible decision space by how you choose to play almost as big as you want it to be.
Right. That's such a good point. Like, that whatever decision space you're looking for in a game is present in Magic if you can find the people to play with that are interested in having that experience with you.
Totally. Do you think, though, I know our discussion of decision space wasn't sort of taking into account all of the sort of deck building decisions the decisions bigger than the game. What if we just speak to that really quickly and sort of like, if someone hasn't played Magic before, like what are the decisions that you're actively making in that? Richard Garfield actually calls this the metagame. And I think modern gaming has gone on to use the word metagame as like a very different thing, right? It's like the competitive choices that players actively make and what's considered good or bad in a game system. But Richard Garfield actually, in the way that he used to use the word metagame, meant like all the stuff you do in the game that's outside of the game, which I think is really interesting. But maybe we can sort of talk people through what we think are the most interesting sort of levers that players have. It's so hard because, like you said, this is a conversation of exceptions. But maybe if we were talking just like one set in like limited or constructed, like what you're sort of doing and the consequences of the color pie and the speed of your deck.
Let's do it. So like ideally, Magic has 3 types of decks. There are aggro decks, there are control decks, and there are combo decks. And the way these decks interact with each other is the aggro deck is really fast. So it can beat the combo deck before the combo deck is able to like set up whatever it's trying to do to win the game. So it keeps that in check. But control decks are really good at destroying creatures, slowing down the game, and stopping what the aggro decks want to do. So the control is there to keep the aggro decks in play. And then finally, of course, the control decks, they take a long time to win the game. So the combo deck has time to set up their combo to win the game before the control deck does, creating a game of rock, paper, scissors, which, at its most ideal is really what you want to have in any given format, because then there's no one dominant strategy, and theoretically any kind of deck that you want to play can be viable.
Totally. And then layered on top of that, the variance of Magic means that even though it does have this sort of RPS system, it doesn't always mean that the aggro deck is going to lose to the control deck.
Right.
Or the combo deck, in your words. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I mean
on average,
that's definitely true. And I think like the game I always want to compare Magic the Gathering to is poker, like Texas Hold'em, and in a lot of ways. And like in Texas Hold'em, if you the famous game of poker, I probably don't need to explain it, but if you have pocket aces and you go all in pre-flop against somebody that has 2-7, you can still lose the pot and go home if 2-2-7 comes up. Yep. Even though the odds were heavily in your favor at the beginning of the game. And I think that's a good example of like what a lot of Magic kind of meta games come down to, is that one of the two players is going to be heavily advantaged at the start of the game based solely on the contents of their decks, but there are ways to influence the outcome of that game inside of that. One of the ways is variance. The other potential option is outplaying your opponent, which is similar to poker. You could get the aces to fold if you have the 2-7.
And because of the level of consequence of the decisions in the decision space, there's really meaningful differences between making the right decision and the wrong decision at certain inflection points in the game. You really can outplay your opponents in a game of Magic.
Right. And a lot of times it comes down to being better at identifying what role you're playing in the game. It's not always, you don't write aggro on the back of your card sleeves, right? And a lot of times, just by virtue of the cards that come up for different players within that one instance of the game, you could play that game 100 times, and in 99 of them, one person is playing the aggro, trying to race to the victory. But in that 1 out of 100 match, just by virtue of the cards and the order they came up, it actually makes sense for the other person to be going on the aggressive strategy. We call it the beatdown in Magic the Gathering. And there's a really, if for those interested, there's a seminal article on Magic strategy called, I think, Who's the Beatdown? That's about this very concept where, it talks about how a big skill separator in Magic is identifying like who is the one that's supposed to be attacking to essentially rush to the end game.
And one of the things that makes that so interesting too, like you were saying, Jake, is you don't always, we're kind of pivoting from like limited or pre-constructed the metagame aspect. But one of the things that makes that so interesting is you don't know what's in your opponent's deck. You can if you know the meta, you can make logical guesses about what's in their deck and what their deck composition is going to be, but you don't know. And if you're playing limited is a way of playing Magic where you either get a set of multiple packs and you build a deck out of that pool, or you're playing a draft where you're opening packs, passing them, picking cards out of them. It's really fun because all the decks sort of look differently, but regardless, no matter how you're playing Magic, you don't know what's in your opponent's deck. So you're making logical guesses about the information you've been given so far, the cards that they've played, the cards that you think a deck like theirs might play in the given format. And for me, that's part of where Magic really comes alive. Is it so much based on like you're trying to make the best guess that you can. But
I totally agree. With that. And like, of course, the caveat there is like, this is like what we're talking about is like competitive play to like
Yeah.
a large extent, right? Like if you're somebody at home who's interested in this podcast because you like board games and having a shelf of board games to play with your friends, like, if you go buy a starter deck of Magic to play, or even a box to do a booster draft at your house, which I mentioned is, a really fun thing to do. It's like, you're not, unless everyone does a lot of research ahead of time about the kind of cards that are in that set and tries to memorize them, like, you're just not going to have that experience. So like the barrier to entry is just so high. But, I do agree. Like when I was invested in it to that level and at the tournament scene, like I would have told you, like, no, Magic is like, it's the most skill intensive game there is. And I think, I think to some degree, I might still agree with that just because of the complexity that exists in the game with 20,000 unique cards.
Totally. And even when you're not playing with 20,000 unique cards, if you're playing like limited with 350 unique cards, it's still a lot to take in and to learn and to think about.
Yeah, it's like you can't really realistically have that experience unless you're all in on Magic, and that's a hard thing to recommend.
Will you really quickly, Jake, talk about the color pie and the mana system and like what is that? And that's like one of the hearts of Magic the Gathering as a game, and I think it's an aspect of the game that people don't necessarily always appreciate if they haven't played. So like, what is it? What does it do?
I don't know what you want me to, where you exactly want to go with this, but just to, when you say color pie, what I'm thinking of is there's exclusively five colors. There are only 5 colors in Magic, and each, I'm trying to think in other board game terms, this would be like the faction color. And so there's blue, red, green, white, and black. And there are, while not all red cards function the same, like there are themes that tie each of these different colors together. So as you might expect, red is the color of fire. So they have like a lot of like direct damage, aggressive strategies. White is healing and defense. Black is like death. So they have like drain life. They have
creature destruction,
like, packs, right? Where it's like pay a cost to get some benefit. Blue is like the illusion, trickery. So they have like counters. Yeah, they have like countering other strategies. That's a huge part of blue. Drawing cards. Blue is like notoriously the strongest set in Magic history because I guess when the game was first designed, they didn't realize that drawing 3 cards was just like a little bit better than gaining 3 life.
They do.
And then last is green, which is like the big creatures. I think of it's also like verdant growth. So they help you get out lands. They help you grow your creatures by giving them like bonus power and that type of thing, and also spawning out different like saproling tokens. So I think green is associated with like growth and power.
Totally.
And then there are all kinds of ways that these colors interact to the point where, people who are very familiar with Magic know that cards that are both green and red are called Gruul, like the Gruul house. And those have their own slightly different identity that combines green and red aspects. And that's true of all color combinations. And even if you were to go to 3 colors, those are all named as well. Like blue, white, red, I believe is like Jeskai, faction. And that's going to be its own separate identity that pulls in from all 3. So like all of those are named, have special identities. And one of the fun things about that is like as a player, you can kind of make choices about like who you are, express yourself and play style through the game by picking colors and strategies within those colors that fit to you as a player.
Totally. And the customizability is something we haven't touched on, and I don't think we need to dive into too much, but I do think it's one of the greatest strengths of Magic. And I think also what I was speaking, that summary was awesome. And to add to it, the color pie, you sort of touch on this, like different colors are good at different things in the game. So every color is associated with a different type of mana, a different land associated with it, right? Forests, islands, mountains, swamps, etc. And to play the cards associated with the color, you have to have the lands associated with that color. So to play more colors, you have to add more different types of lands, which means you're adding more variance into your deck. But because different colors have different strengths and weaknesses, Magic is a game that gives players control over the decision, do I want to have a palette of a deck that has answers to everything, but has higher variance because I won't always have the mana to cast the spells in my deck? Or do I want to play a deck that's just one color? So I'm always going to have at least the color of mana that I need to cast the spells in my hand, but I won't always have answers to all the different types of threats that my opponent's deck will have. And I think that's where the color pie of Magic is so interesting, because it puts this incentivization in the way that players choose to play of, okay, I could just play black, red, but I'm going to have a really hard time dealing with other players' enchantments. Or I could just play green, but if I just play green, if I don't have creatures on the board, I'm going to have a really hard time dealing with my opponent's creatures. And this is something that's been developed over the course of the game, but it makes the decision space, it creates this sort of like core risk reward to how you approach building your deck, where players can choose how much variance they're comfortable with, or really where they want their variance to be. Do they want their variance to be in matchups, or do they want their variance to be in their draw?
Right. Yeah. And I think if you're not familiar with Magic, you might be thinking to yourself like, okay, well, why don't I just use all the best cards from all the different colors? I'll use the best creatures and the best creature destruction and the best counter spells. To that, like, Magic has this really interesting risk reward element to building your deck. You absolutely can do that. There's nothing stopping you, but you have to draw the right lands out of your deck in order to have the resource available to play those cards. So the more different colors you're trying to incorporate into your deck, the more unlikely it will be that your base of lands will be able to sustain that, so that you'll actually be able to play the cards that you want when you want to play them. Because if you draw green, blue, and red cards, but you drew the white and black lands out of your deck, then you've got a bunch of duds and nothing to do with them.
And then you get to blame your deck for like mana screwing you and being bad, which I actually think is one of the strengths of Magic, is that it lets players hide behind its variance. When ultimately in a lot of games where players lose, they probably could have made decisions that would have helped them win with less variance. But before we pivot
or in before the game started, right? Like often, right? Oh, well, you might feel like you got unlucky, but maybe you picked a deck that was just not suited for the decks present in that event.
Totally.
So a lot, again, I think, just to put a finer point on it, like, I still feel like the decision space on any given turn, when you're actually playing the game, is quite small. You are working towards a bigger decision space, but there is an enormous decision space in Magic. It's just those decisions are taking place often like at a level beyond that decision you're making on your turn. It's, how did you even get here?
In some ways, it's kind of like talking about the flavors in food. Like, any given game of Magic is like eating one meal, right? Like, there's so many flavors contained in it, but the flavors in food generally, or the decisions in Magic generally, are massive. But when you sit down at the table, your meal overall is probably going to trend in one direction, or what you're eating, your dish, is going to trend like, oh, this is trending sweet.
That's such I didn't know where you were going with that at all. I'm not going to lie. I was like, what are you talking about? But I think that makes sense. Like you can have a bad meal, but it doesn't mean you don't like food.
Yeah. Totally. And if you don't like a flavor, there's tons of other flavors in the decision space. There's tons of other flavors to try.
Right. You're just not going to get much of it in any one game.
Totally. And I think that this is a really natural point.
Color, pie, food.
What? It was all along. This is the longest con. I kind of feel some turbulence coming on though, chick. I can hear it in your voice.
Is that because you mentioned lands?
Well, yes. This is going to be a good discussion, but that is because I mentioned lands, and I know let's jump into it.
This is your captain speaking. We are now approaching a little bit of turbulence. Please return to your seats and buckle your safety belts.
Okay, so as I mentioned in my synopsis, like there are like this magic is amazing. Like I feel like I can't say that enough, especially now that I've said it was a 6.5 out of 10, and if I don't say that a few more times this podcast, like I'm gonna get some angry emails. But like it is a flawed game by modern game standards to me, and I think a huge reason for that is that a large percent of games end up being non-games because of variance. By that I mean you do not draw out of your deck the amount of lands that you need to play an actual game of Magic because you don't draw enough, and therefore like there's nothing you can do. You can't play your cards, or you draw too many, in which case like there's nothing you can do because you have no cards to play, or one of those two things is happening to your opponent while you're able to play a game of Magic. And, I don't know how often that truly happens, but I do believe it is frequent enough that any modern game that came out that had that same percentage of non-games would be panned to hell. They'd be like, it would be completely unacceptable. That's I think you don't necessarily agree.
So it's not that I don't agree. Well, I do disagree, but I totally.
It's not that I don't agree. It's that I disagree.
I think that this point is really valid, and I think that what you're saying as someone who played Magic for a really long time, as someone who is really invested, at the end of the day, the amount of time you put into the game, too often when it mattered, you felt like you didn't have agency. And that's a failure of the game.
And often those are in game. I feel like when I say that, it could come across as though I'm like saying, well, like, obviously I'm noticing more the games where I feel as though I got unlucky. That's a very human and typical thing for people to do. But I think like by the same side of the coins, like a lot of times people don't recognize enough the times that like they were the lucky ones and they're sitting across the table from someone who is having that negative experience. And you're just like, whatever, like I won, so I'm happy. but no, like that's not acceptable either from a game design perspective.
I think it is. I think that when Richard Garfield set out to make Magic, he wasn't setting out to make chess. And I think that the level of variance in the game means that it's relatively easy to find opponents because I can play games with people who are significantly worse than me, and we can still have an interesting game, even if I'm going to win much more often than not, because I'm going to lose sometimes. And this is a personal taste thing, right? Like everyone has a degree to which they're comfortable losing a game that they're better at than the other player because of variance. But I think that for me, the mana system, Magic came out in 1993. And I think the next 20 years of games in this style, dueling card games, were a response to the mana system. And I have played a bunch of those games. And I think I've come down on if it's not broke, don't fix it. Like the lands are evocative. They're interesting. They create dynamic gameplay. So many people are like raging at me right now and like shaking their table. And like, I get it. This is not a game type that is for everyone, but I think the benefits of the mana system and the variance, the variety of decision spaces that it creates, the opportunities for risk reward that it creates on turn 3, I might have a choice between 2 different cards that I could play, right? Like, and if I draw my 4th land, I don't have a 4th land in hand, could really impact that decision. And I have to take a meaningful risk on that turn to say, do I think I'm going to draw the land I need or am I not? And I think that all of those things create a really interesting play space. And I totally get it, Jake. And it's such valid criticism. But I think as someone who played Magic for a long time, played a ton of other card games, and then has come back, I think the mana system is one of the best parts. It makes every game feel different. And it sucks when it feels bad, but it does so much good.
I'm going to come back on you a little bit because I don't agree with your point that like you can just play Magic easily with somebody at a vastly different skill level and engagement. I think like, well, yes, like you could get mana screwed one way or another. Sorry, I shouldn't say mana screwed. I think that's like not really a great term, but you could get like bad mana and one way or another, and the other person wins. But that's not going to be a fun experience. I mean, yeah, okay, like you've won, but you're not like actually engaging with the game. And also like because of the incredibly high barrier to really play, like we talked at length about, to like know what cards the other person can have, like you're going to be playing a different game than they are. Like I've tried to teach Magic to a lot of people over the course of my life and had really very little success with anyone, with the exception of people that were like, I want to play Magic, like will you teach me how to play, right? It's like if they're going to take that initiative and they want to do the burden, like take on that burden to like learn all this stuff, then like awesome, like that can happen. But I just don't agree that like because that variance. And again, like I'll go back to poker. Like in poker, the best player in the world can lose to the worst player by just variance. But the significant difference is like after 5 minutes of explaining how to play, both people are aware of the universe of possibilities at a level that is just not the case in Magic. So while the end result could be the same in Magic versus poker with the worst player coming out on top, I feel like it's much more acceptable in a game like poker than it is in Magic.
Such good points. I will say, I think that there's a spectrum. So you're so right that like you can't just sit down and be playing like a really rich game of Magic with someone who's not close in skill level. But I think the variance tightens it. It makes this number of skill chains that you can play, the sort of levels of skill chains above you that you can play, larger than a game like chess. But also the variance of when you don't have the right mana is a spectrum. The games at the very edge do feel horrible and you're not really playing the game, and that sucks. But there's also a whole swath of game types in that range where maybe you miss a land drop here or you miss a land drop there, but you can make interesting decisions and recover that lead to really interesting games, I would argue. And then also to your point, yeah, Magic is really complicated and really complex. And teaching someone the rules, it's easier to teach someone the rules of chess than it is to teach someone the rules of Magic. But I think it's easier to teach someone how to play Magic than it is to teach someone how to play chess.
Yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying. I mean, I think like to actually know the rules of Magic is like you have to like go to like school for that, and, like pass tests. Like
totally.
The last thing I'll say about in this turbulence, and it's sticking with the land point, which is that like, okay, so Magic is like a predatory model that makes tons of money by like selling products where they're sealed products. So I don't want to like go into depth about that, about how like it's like playing up people, like gambling tendencies, like want to gamble and like take risks, is make bad choices to like buy this sealed products because it could be this like really expensive card when like more than likely it's gonna be not what you want, which will encourage you to buy another pack in the hopes that you get that like really good card. But because lands, and the reason this plays into lands is because like there aren't just islands, mountains, swamps, forests, and plains in the game, but there are better lands that account for multiples of those. There are all kinds of lands that can function as two of the five. So if you're playing a deck that has more than one color in it, like you want to use these better lands, and those are often some of the most cost prohibitive cards in the game, which just like is weird because it's the most like like you literally need these to play, and it's just like, to me it's like the epitome of like the rich kid problem, as Richard Garfield himself put it with Magic, which is that like a lot of times like you can just buy better variants than somebody else in Magic, and that I think is worth mentioning. And it was honestly like when I played competitively as a kid, I wished I could have engaged in that rock paper scissors of the meta game and chose the deck, but instead I was exclusively playing the cheapest viable strategy because that was the only thing I could afford. Which and the fact that I could afford any of those is just demonstrates like how incredibly privileged I am that like my parents spent hundreds of dollars every month for me to like play this card game and hobby I was engaged in. That so like to complain about that is maybe not even right. That I was able to play at that level at all, because simply put, like there are many people that would probably love to play Magic, be very good at Magic, that are just priced out.
Totally. And I think that that's so fair, Jake. And the fact that, to use Richard Garfield's own language, Magic being a game that's bigger than the box, that's the cost of Magic being a game that's bigger than its box, and all of the richness that leads to, that's the downside. And that's a huge downside. For a board game podcast, which we are, it's incredible that when you buy a board game outside of expansions, you own the game. You own the whole game. And that's all right there. And that's, for me, that's like one of the coolest aspects. And I don't know how much we want to delve into the sort of like economy side of things, because that is like one of the biggest downsides of Magic, is like it's expensive to play. It's hard to get, but there are cheaper ways to play it. Like I had a ton of fun in middle school playing with like the cards that I had. But as you get older, it's hard to play when you know that a bigger decision space exists.
There are ways that you can do Magic on the cheap. You could get together with a group of 10 friends and say, we're all going to buy 10 packs, and that's gonna like the price of a board game, of a modern board game or whatever, and we're gonna make decks out of that, and we're gonna trade cards, and that's gonna be our meta game. And like one could do that, but it's like I think these days, like when I want to play a game, like I want to be playing the best version of that game. And I think like for many people, I would feel that way. Like, okay, well, like this is fun, and like maybe an interesting way to like experience the game, but like, is it Magic at its kind of best?
I think that's super fair. Though I will say, I think for a long time I felt the pressure of like, I want to play Magic at its best. So I avoided it entirely, right? Like I thought like, oh, I need to play like standard, or I need to have access to all these cards. And as I've gotten older, I started playing like limited Magic a little bit more on Magic Arena in just the last couple months, really enjoy it. And I think I'm at a point in my life now where I would love to just like, those friends in middle school who I still see sometimes randomly, I know if we threw together decks and played, we would have so much fun because of the core game. And I know we're running long, Jake, but the one thing I want to discuss before we go to our closing topic is if you'll allow me, can we talk about bluffing in Magic?
Yeah,
because I think that this is the heart of the game that people don't talk about. And for me, it's where the game lives.
I agree. And I mean, there's like a reason why I want to compare Magic to like Texas Hold'em. It's all about bluffing, really, at its core. And who knows if it was inspired by poker, but I mean, like this is such a foundational game in our hobby of board games generally. It's like, what else is like a really foundational game? It's poker, like
totally.
People have been doing for hundreds of years, and there's a reason why that is so fun, so exciting, and so dramatic.
Yeah. And one thing we've talked about wanting to talk about more on the podcast is this sort of idea of like games that live in spaces where the core game doesn't change a lot. So like we've mentioned, fighting games are sort of that, right? Like you're making the similar decisions over and over again, but they remain interesting. And bluffing, I think in Magic, a lot of times bluffing is like, okay, you're signaling that you might have a certain card by leaving your mana up, or you're attacking at a time where it would be very foolish to launch that attack.
Let's paint the picture. So
okay,
if I'm and playing an aggressive strategy, right? I'm trying to rush the end game. I have a 2 power, 2 toughness creature, and Brendan on his side of the board, he's playing the more controlling strategy, and he has a 4 power, 4 toughness creature. I can choose to attack him with my creature in what would appear to be a complete
stupid,
foolish mistake, because he can simply block with his 4/4 creature, kill my creature, and there's no cost because in Magic, creatures' life total, toughness, or whatever resets at the beginning of the next turn. So the reason Magic is so great and works as a bluffing game is because Brendan doesn't know what I have in my hand. What I'm doing, he might still choose not to block because I'm signaling, like, I obviously know that he could easily block. So why then am I choosing this attack if not for having some way to increase the power of my creature, damage his creature in some other way, or perhaps a combat trick that would mean that my creature survives and his does not.
And I think it's not a mistake that Magic has lasted 30 years and that is such a quintessential aspect of its decision space and its game playing experience, right? Because it hits, we've mentioned poker so many times, and like it hits that sort of game feeling in its very sort of arcane setup. And it's just good. That's just a good space to exist in when you're playing a game. Yeah. And it doesn't get old.
And there are a lot of things like in that, like in this bluffing space is like, those are the moments in Magic that I feel like most outplays happen that make you feel smart. And it's so great because like very frequently that means like you're doing something that is like objectively wrong if you're just trying to play the game like efficiently, but it works out because of you're making your opponent do something even worse. So like, for example, you could choose not to play a land for the turn and hold that back in your hand as though it's a combat trick or some other effect. And I've seen like some just spectating. I remember being at a tournament and like saw a kid who was playing a blue deck, a counterspell deck, and he was just holding onto a hand of 5 islands while his opponent is just sweating bullets on the other side of the table. I'm sure that kid still lost the game because like at a certain point, like it's not going to happen. But like just that Magic allows you to do these things that are theoretically wrong. Like it's wrong to attack with this creature, just like it's wrong to raise your bet when I have a 2/7 offsuit in my hand. But in both cases, like very frequently that bluff can pay off big.
And to break down that example for people who haven't played Magic, the reason why holding 5 islands, which is just mana, feels so scary is like every card in your opponent's hand is an opportunity to do something. And when you're sitting across from a blue deck with 5 cards, all you're thinking is, oh my God, they're going to negate the next 5 things I try to do. And it'll
change your behavior too. So you're like, okay, I can't play this card I really want to play because surely they have at least one counter spell. So I'm going to do something way less optimal, theoretically giving the other player a chance to start drawing into some effects and potentially come back and win the game, which they certainly would be out of if the other person said, nope, they're just bluffing. I'm just going to jam my win condition right now.
Totally. So, and I feel like that is really vital to the decision space. So to not, cast off our lens and have this slip into review, one thing that's magic about Magic is that it makes the decision space. You said it so perfectly, Jake. Magic's a game that's about so much more than efficiency, and that makes Magic a game that's about being human. And for me, the fact that Magic offers the players a decision space that lets them express themselves in these ways is what makes it this sort of lasting game that's casting this long shadow.
Totally. And I do want to say, like, I don't want my comments in Turbulence to I don't want anyone to think that means I think it's not like well suited as a competitive game. Like there's tons of variance in the game, but like as long as you accept that, as a player, that you're not going to win, 100% of the time. That like if I play the best, if I'm the best player in the world, I might win 55-60% of my games. As a top level player against other top competition, which I think is close to what the best players in the world on the Magic Pro Tour do win. like and that will ultimately mean I have a great career. I win tournaments, but I'll also lose a lot of games to people not as good as me. Like that is great, and that's the same way. Same thing in poker, right? The Phil Ivies of the world don't win every major tournament. A lot of times, some random Joe can show up, get lucky, and win. And the same is true in Magic. And I think that's like a wonderful thing. It's just not, I think, what a lot of people are looking for if you're a board game enthusiast who's like wanting to have a great experience with some friends on a Saturday night.
Totally.
It can be. You just have to be bought into that idea.
Yep, definitely. Before we close up, for everyone who's played Magic in the past, I think it'd be valuable for us to give 2 card stories, just really quickly, 2 cards that sort of shaped your experience of the game. Do you want to go first?
That sounds great. Can we go like back?
You, me, you?
Yeah. All right.
We'll take Magic turns.
Okay, we'll take that. Perfect. Okay, so I've always been, and this is honestly I think the reason for this is because of financial reasons. Like I've always been a primarily red player. The red aggressive archetype is almost always a viable strategy in any format, and people call the deck Red Deck Wins, and it's just about 20. It's great because it's only red cards, so you only need mountains. You have no benefit of playing with like the 20 and 30 and up to $500 special lands. And so, yeah, right. So it's basically commons, and you're just trying to use the most aggressive cards possible to win before your opponent gets any opportunity to do anything. And in older formats, a card that allows this to be viable is a card called Blood Moon, and it's a 3 casting cost enchantment that says all non-basic lands are mountains. And so this is a card we didn't even mention that in Magic you can have a sideboard of cards. So this is a card that's typically in the sideboard of red decks. In formats where Blood Moon is allowed. And what that means is very frequently you bring it in games 2 and 3. And on the 3rd turn of the game, you can put down an enchantment that means all that just turns in a very literal way, all of your opponents like $2,000 worth of lands into your 1 cent mountains. And it means they can't play their cards. They can't do anything they want to do. And it can be almost like a guaranteed win that can race your $20 or $60 deck past the finish line.
As a kid, so this story makes me so happy because as a kid, I opened a Blood Moon actually. And I was like, what is this for? I don't understand this at all. I was like, this is the dumbest card I've ever seen. Like, I'm so mad that my rare is a Blood Moon. And I think that it really speaks to the power of playing Magic in different ways, that like one of your cards, because of the way that you were playing Magic, is Blood Moon. That makes me so happy. And obviously now, like I know the story of Blood Moon and like why it's good, but like that's so cool. So my card, my first one, I'm also going to tell you my second one is going to be a combo. So I'm cheating and I'm doing 2 cards for the second one. But my first card is a card called Control Magic. Control Magic is a blue card. It costs 2 of any color of mana and then 2 islands. And it says you control enchanted permanent. And Control Magic sauntered onto the scene of my middle school Magic one day where I think I was in the end of my 7th grade year, and just threw itself on the table. And we saw this card because one of my friends, Alex, had unearthed a collection of cards from his older brother. And he played Control Magic, and he was like, I'm taking your Shivan Dragon. And I was like, no. That is not how the card works, Alex. Like, that is cheating. There's no way. But that is how Control Magic works. You literally take control of someone else's card. And we didn't fully know the rules. And it felt so powerful to me. But it was a perfect example about how the game was so much bigger than we could even imagine. Eventually, we accepted that, yes, that is exactly what Control Magic did. It was called Control Magic. You took control of someone else's card. But in the moment, it just felt so dastardly. And I loved the fact that that card's just really stuck with me. And it's an example of how Magic is a game that there's always something else the design will do to surprise you.
Totally. I think, yeah, that's awesome. I think My second card, I'm just like shuffling through Magic cards in my mind. I don't want to pick another red card, but like I would love to pick like Goblin Pile Driver or Lightning Bolt. Those are some really
Classics.
good ones, some classics. But I think the card that I want to highlight, just because when I first learned about this card, it just made me think like, it's like, what the heck is this? Like, this game is so crazy. And that card is Battle of Wits. Are you familiar with Battle of Wits?
I am familiar with Battle of Wits. Oh my god. Okay.
So I think this just highlights like just what a wild and insane game Magic is, of a game of exceptions. So Magic, of course, it's this epic game of two dueling mages where you're trying to fight to get your opponent's life total down to 0 from 20. And Battle of Wits says, no, Magic's not a game about that at all. Magic is a game of me doing totally random things and trying to just somehow get lucky and find a win. So basically what Battle of Wits says is, I hope I'm getting this right. I think it says if you have 250 cards in your deck at the start of your turn, you win the game. 200 or more. If you have 200 or more cards in your deck, you win the game. So it completely changes the win condition, but it does so much more than that because it also changes like fundamentally like everything about how you would build a deck. Like, decks you always use the minimum number of allowed cards because you can go more, but literally it's unheard of. Nobody would ever do that because you only want to use the 60 best cards. But Battle of Wits says, nope, you're going to use 200. You're going to find all kinds of crazy things like nobody else is doing. And, you're going to get cards that search your deck for things, cards that help you draw cards, cards that help keep you alive. So, you can't just use 200. You have to play like 220 or 250 because, if you draw a Battle of Wits and it's, you don't have that many cards in your deck at that time, well, that's no good. So it's just a hilarious card, and it actually can be like a viable winning strategy. It has been in various metas throughout Magic history. I've played, I've never had a Battle of Wits deck myself, but like there have been people that I've played with a lot that would break them out at tournaments or fun casual events and like just shuffle this like massive stack of cards. And I just think like that's just one of the joyous things about Magic is like, everything that Magic is, like sometimes it's not even about that at all.
So the first time I'm so happy you just told a Battle of Wits story, Jake. The first time I convinced my friends to go to a store. I talked about this last episode, the competitive episode, to go play Magic. We played Draft a couple times, and I convinced them, no, we got to go play Standard. And it was during Odyssey block, the block that Battle of Wits came out. I forgot this memory entirely until you mentioned this. And I sat down to my first round match. I was like, I love Magic. Like, my deck's so good. Like, I got all the cards right from the right sets. Like, this is going to be great. And I sit down, and this guy across from me pulls out a stack of cards. And I was like, that is a really big deck. And he sets it down on the table. And I was like, okay, I'm definitely going to beat this guy. He's playing with way too many cards. Then he reaches down into his backpack, and he pulls down a second stack of exactly the equal size cards. And then I'm like, mouth agog, looking across the table. I'm like, what is going on? And he reaches down and he pulls a third stack and he goes, these are part of my 300 card Battle of Wits deck. I just want you to know I'm going to beat you. And I was like, what is going on? And we start playing. And I lose this game. He beats me with Battle of Wits. And at the end, basically he gets it out and he goes, would you like me to count my cards or do you accept defeat? And I was like, I accept defeat. I accept defeat.
I just want to go home.
Yeah. But it was so, yeah, Magic's crazy. I love that about Magic. That's I feel like this is a sidebar and I'm going to keep it so short, but like Yu-Gi-Oh got developed as like the world of card games is so wild and like you never know what to expect. And I feel like it was based off experiences like that where like, what is going on even in this experience? Okay, my final cards. Young budding game designer, love card games. I'm putting combos together, thinking through things. In the Onslaught block, or this card called Kamal Fist of Krosa was released. I love this character Kamal. He'd previously been a red card, and he transitioned to green. Green, one of my favorite colors. So I was like, I have to make this card work. On it, it says you can pay 1 green mana and turn a land into a 1/1 creature that is still a land. That's pretty cool. This could work. It has another ability that lets you buff creatures, so that's a nice combo. Grow your lands. But then I was reading through all my cards one of those days after school and saw the card Tremor. Tremor is a red card that says deal 1 damage to every creature in play. And I thought, oh my goodness, I can make all of my friends' lands 1/1 creatures and destroy them all at once with Tremor? And this is how I learned with great power comes great responsibility. Because no one wanted to play me after they played this deck like one time. Because they're like, this isn't fun. Why did you do this? Like, I literally by like turn 5 would make all of my friends' lands out into 1/1s, destroy them with Tremor, and then next turn they could play 1 land. Oh, you have 1 land. It's turn 6. And it was just I think it was one of my earliest moments of like in-game design, in deck building. It's very important that you ensure other players fun. And we weren't playing in a super competitive environment, and that's why I say that. Also, everyone refused to play, and I had to build a new deck the next time. But it was like the most fun combo ever. I loved it when I got to do it.
That's so awesome. Yeah, and I mean that's funny too because it's like another way of like, yeah, like Magic. You can attack and pick apart any part of the game, right? You can attack somebody's lands, like the lands themselves. Like that's a totally viable strategy, and it just points to the fact that like a lot of the best and most iconic decks in Magic history are doing that. They're just like attacking the game in some interesting and weird way, and very frequently non-interactive or fun way. But yeah, I mean, it's a fun game, and I discovered is a really popular YouTube channel, like I think Remy MTG, when we were prepping for this. And I was just doing some Magic research, and he does all these like fun songs about Magic and like parodies of other songs, and like just the fact that like that can exist for Magic, and like so many people can like share like these inside jokes about the game, and like as I was like watching these videos and like seeing a lot of these, I'm so glad you asked about the cards, like because he's like talks about random cards that are like unlocking memories, like things I haven't thought about in so long. Like, oh yeah, Solemn Simulacrum, like that was this, crazy like Dark Steel card that was like so good, and just did everything, and like I'll be like all of a sudden I'm just like back there at that Friday night, smelly Friday Night Magic, and yeah, so like it'll always be an important game for me. It's not always the game I want to play the most right now. It's not one I would recommend really to anyone. But if somebody's like, I'm interested in Magic, like, should I go forth? Like,
yeah,
with my blessing, like, and have the best time ever.
Enter the plane,
right?
Or planes, totally. There's so much we could go into. I think you just succinctly summed it up so well. And obviously, there's many hundreds of podcasts devoted to all of Magic the Gathering. But I too sort of echo Jake's sentiment. If you in any way, shape, or form have been like, this does sound kind of interesting, maybe just look at like ways I can play casually at home and just try playing the game that way. It's many games. And I will say recently, the limited I've been playing in Kaldheim, so fun. It's been such a good game. But with that, I think that is pretty succinct for a game that spans 30 years almost. And do you have any closing thoughts on Magic, Jake? Or should we jump into the adios?
Okay, here's what I'll say. Like a lot of these games that we are talking about on this podcast, even the games we really like, in a year or 2 years, like, are we going to be playing them? I hope so. But like, would I be shocked if like Underwater Cities, like a game I gave a 9.5 on this very podcast, is 2-3 years down the line, if it's like kind of an afterthought, if it's something I haven't touched in a while or thought about in a while, like that's very plausible. Yeah. But like I just feel like Magic is going to be around forever. Like I could be, it'll be 10 years from now. And if a buddy's like, hey, do you want to come over and do a little booster draft? And I'll be like, you know it, man, I'll bring a 6-pack. Like, let's have the best time ever. And like, so I just Like, I feel like it's always going to be a part of my life in some small way, even if I'm not actively playing it. And it's, if I ever have kids, like, they're going to have a huge trough of random unsorted Magic cards to dig through one day. And I think that will be wonderful.
That sums it up perfectly. The first 30 years of Magic were pretty cool. I bet the next 30 are going to be pretty sweet too. But if you are part of the pre-planners, the group of listeners who likes to play along with us and join in on the fun, next week, join our Roll and Write Dark Ritual as we jump into Welcome to, one of the most celebrated roll and write games out there. And if you're looking to play it from home and you don't have a copy, Welcome to actually a game you can play by yourself, but you can also play it on Board Game Arena. So take a look there. I think the implementation's pretty good. Jake?
We'll talk about it next week.
We'll talk about it. Okay. Besides that, thank you so much for listening. You made it so far in the podcast. Follow us, talk to us, yell at us on Twitter at Decision Spa. A few folks have been engaging with us there. It's so cool. And someone actually told us that they bought Underwater Cities after listening to our podcast on it, which is amazing. That's so
our first game.
So amazing. I hope you guys really enjoyed it. And thanks for listening to the podcast. We have a blog on Board Game Geek now where we are posting every new episode, so you can engage with it there. Whenever we do a game-based episode, we always post on the forums. Not happening for Magic. Don't look for it. You're not going to find it. I don't even know where to post it. And as a reminder, check the show notes for our new Discord. Come talk to us. Let us know your thoughts.
You can flame us there too.
I guess with that, behold the multiverse, and I hope you have an awesome week.
Yeah, see you next week.
You are now exiting the decision space. Thanks for listening. Please take care and enjoy the rest of your game.